In this video, we're going to look at some simple operators that are used for doing math. You're not going to need to do a lot of math in the examples we're going through in this course, but some simple arithmetic is something that comes up pretty often. So let's take a look at that now. The first four operators are pretty simple, and if you've ever used a calculator program on a computer, these will probably be familiar to you. We have, of course, the plus operator, which will take two numbers and add them. So 2 plus 5 is 7. We also have the minus key, which is actually a hyphen. So 4 minus 3 is 1. And of course, JavaScript is well aware of negative numbers and things. So 5 minus 9 is negative 4. Now, to do multiplication, you don't use an x. You use the asterisk. So 3 asterisk 5 is 3 times 5, which is 15. And then finally, we use a slash to do division. So 36 divided by 6 is 6. And when you start getting into fractions, the result is expressed using a decimal point. So these are all fairly straightforward, probably nothing you haven't seen before. But now we're going to look at a few things that might be a little unusual. So the first one is the modulus operator. The modulo operator takes the first operand, divides it by the second, and then returns the remainder of that division. So this is often used for determining programmatically whether a number is even or odd. So in this case, we're looking at 20 divided by 2 and then take the remainder. So 20 divided by 2 is 10, and there's no remainder. So we should expect this to return 0, and it does. But 19 is an odd number. So 19 divided by 2 is 9 with a remainder of 1. So there you go. Now what this means is that you can use this to determine whether a variable is even or odd. And you can also use it to find out arbitrary multiple information. But I think most people's first time being exposed to the modulus operator in terms of programming is for finding out whether things are even or odd. You can use that information if, say, your JavaScript is outputting rows of a table, and you want to be able to separately style every alternate line. Then you could output a CSS class based on whether the current row is odd or even. And you could use the modulus operator to help you do that. Now let's look at incrementing and decrementing, which is something you do all the time in programming. I'm going to clear this console first. So let's say I have a variable called counter, which starts out at 0. Many times when you're working through something in programming, you need to keep track of how often you've done it. And so every time you do whatever that unit of work is, you tell the counter, all right, I've done this one more time, so increment yourself. So there's various ways that we can express, hey, add 1 to this variable. So the first one is to take counter and assign it to itself plus 1. That returns 1, so we know now that counter has been set to 1. If you don't believe me, let's try this. There we go. So that's one way, but it's a little verbose. And there's always this tension in programming between keeping things verbose so they're easy to read and making it so you don't have to type a lot of stuff every time you want to do something that's fairly simple that people do a lot. So there are various ways to express the same thing that are a little shorter. The first one is to take your variable name and use the plus equals operator. So in this case, if I say counter plus equals 1, this is expressing exactly what this statement expresses, but it's a little shorter. Still relatively clear though. You can see that what we want to do is just add 1 and set it to counter. There's another way that people will do this as well. And that is to take the variable name and simply add 2 plus signs on the end of it. This will only work for incrementing by 1, whereas with this version, you can increment by any arbitrary number. So for example, I could say counter plus equals 5. I could even use a negative number. I could say counter plus equals negative 4. So you can use whichever of these feels right to you. You could even use this version, but most of the time in the code that you'll be reading, and odds are if you do enough programming, the code that you yourself will be writing, you'll use a version like this or like this. Similarly to incrementing, there's also decrementing operators, which are exactly the same thing, except instead of using a plus, you'd use a minus. So if I want to count down from somewhere, I could say counter minus equals 1. Counter goes down to 3. And then counter minus minus. You could see that the value returned here was not 3, but the actual value is 2. It's what we expect. This could be considered an argument for using this version instead of using this version. But really, they all do effectively the same thing. One thing that's worth mentioning is that all of the arithmetic operators we've seen so far work with this syntax. So, for example, counter asterisk equals 2 will double counter. I don't see this kind of construct very often in the code that I look at or the code that I write, but if you ever do see it, that's what this means. One more note about these arithmetic operators. Plus also works on strings, but when you use it with strings, it's called a concatenation operator. So if I say cat plus dog, I get cat dog. They're stuck together. If you ever want to combine strings as words, you need to make sure that the spaces are included somewhere. So in this case, cat space plus dog will give you cat dog like that. You could also do cat plus space and another plus dog, cat and dog. So the plus operator works on strings to concatenate them together while working in arithmetic terms as just simple addition. So that is an overview of the most common and probably most useful arithmetic operators and what they do, including a little exception about how they work on strings.